In a powerful show of support for nature, nearly every government in the world united behind the CBD's sweeping biodiversity plan for life on Earth. They committed to halting the extinction of threatened animal, plant, and fungi species. And in an historic first, they also committed to helping those species recover, so that the life we share our planet with can not only survive, but thrive. Making these goals a reality will take all of us working together. Reverse the Red is supporting governments, conservation experts, and communities around the world as they join forces to activate tried and tested tools and tie global efforts to local expertise. All in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can secure our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Long. I'm the Programme Officer at SULI, which is the Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group at the IUCN, part of the Species Survival Commission and CESP. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining from wherever you are in the world. I'll be doing a quick presentation, a quick introduction now to some of our panelists. So we have Dilys Rowe, who is the chair of SULI, the Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, and we have Nastia Timashina from Traffic, and we have Tina Hiller from EWT. And we'll be talking about two new tools for assessing the sustainability of the use of wild species. That is the 5-dimensional sustainability assessment framework and the species use database. And we're going to kick it off with Dilys. I'll pass over to Dilys now, and she'll be discussing a bit of a background of the 5-dimensional sustainability assessment framework, its creation, and then we'll be moving on to some information about the testing regime that it's undergone from Nastia and from Tina, and then I'll be talking about the species use database. So I'd like to pass over to Dilys. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. Yes, I'm Dilys Rowe. I'm the chair of SULI. And these two tools that we want to present to you are tools that have been developed under the banner of SULI with involvement of a number of different partners. And they're both concerned with the sustainable use of species. Sustainable use is one of the 3 pillars of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's quite often a tool that's used to generate incentives for conservation. If you use species, you can derive benefits from them, and so therefore there's an incentive to conserve them. And so it can really help, as long as it is genuinely sustainable, in the conservation of all species, including threatened species. So it can make a key contribution to reversing the red. So this first tool that we want to present to you is called the 5-dimensional sustainability assessment framework. And this is a tool that was developed through a project involving SULI, IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is where I work, Traffic, Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa, and EPIC Biodiversity. And the project was funded by the UK government's Darwin Initiative. And the purpose of the project was to develop a framework and then test that framework for assessing the sustainability of different wildlife uses. So that could be crocodile farming, or it could be elephant hunting, or it could be medicinal plant collecting, a whole range of different types of uses of wild species. And we developed the framework, really. We had the idea of the project in response to a sort of a pushback against sustainable use, and a feeling that because sustainable use often entails the killing of some iconic wild species, people are thinking this can't be anything to do with conservation. But actually, sustainable use, and as demonstrated in the IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment, involves a huge wide range of practices, both lethal and non-lethal, both extractive and non-extractive, and a whole wide range of species. And it's really provides benefits to billions and billions of people who all rely on sustainable use of wild species. Our framework also responds to concerns that were raised at the time of COVID around the human health impacts of some forms of wildlife use, and also concerns about animal welfare associated with some forms of wildlife use. And finally, it responds to the Global Biodiversity Framework, both in targets 5 and 9 of the framework. These talk about sustainable use, but they talk about the need for it to be legal and safe as well as sustainable. So our framework helps assess whether different uses of wildlife are indeed sustainable as well as being legal and safe. So the idea was to develop a proof of concept framework and then to test that against a variety of different situations. So what we did was look at a whole range of different sustainability frameworks, certification standards, other principles on different aspects of sustainability, particularly where they're related to wild species use. And we looked beyond the 3 conventional pillars of sustainability. So conventionally, we think about sustainability in terms of ecological sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. And to respond to those concerns raised during COVID, and also the CBD GBF requirement for use to be safe, we also looked at animal welfare and human health standards. So based on an analysis of international good practice, drawing from a whole wide range of principles and standards, we put together this framework with our 5 dimensions of sustainability. And for each dimension, we have 7 different principles. I couldn't fit the whole framework onto my slide, but that's just an example of 3 of the principles across each of the 5 dimensions. And we then have 7 cross-cutting principles which address issues around legality, traceability, and so on. So overall, our framework consists of 49 principles. We then developed an Excel-based tool for applying all these principles to a particular enterprise or sustainable use initiative. So for each of the principles that are all listed down here on an assessment sheet, we allocate each one of them a score between 0 and 3. 0 in this case indicates bad practice. 3 is exemplary practice, with 1 or 2 being in between. And we've provided indicators which demonstrate bad practice and exemplary practice against each of our principles. So whoever's doing this assessment, it might be an enterprise owner, it might be carried out independently, it might be done by a group of stakeholders who all have an interest in a particular use. They can discuss what score they should allocate to each principle. Now, of course, not all principles are relevant to all uses. So our animal welfare principles are, for example, not relevant to uses that are purely about plant use. And you can also score a principle as not being relevant to your particular use, and then it doesn't affect your overall score. So for each principle, you either say it's not relevant or you give it a score, and then you have to provide evidence as to why you've given it that score. So examples, we've seen the management plan for this, we've seen the benefit sharing plan, for example. And for activities or for principles that score poorly, so a 0 or a 1, we provide an opportunity to suggest where improvements might be made going forward in order to enhance the sustainability. When you've entered a score for each of the principles, you get a total score for each of your dimensions and for the cross-cutting principles. and you get one of these radar chart diagrams, and that shows you overall how your enterprise scored. So you can see for this imaginary one, it scored well on animal welfare and human health. It scored less well on social sustainability and economic sustainability, and it scored somewhere in the middle on ecological sustainability. So it's just a very broad brush tool to help you see, oh, I'm performing quite well here, but clearly I need to put in a bit more effort to boost my economic sustainability. So it gives you an idea of how you're doing and where there might be ways to improve. We've tested this framework against a number of different situations. You'll hear about 2 of those today. So that's wild meat production in Tanzania, game ranching in South Africa, but also we've looked at reptile skin production in Indonesia and Zimbabwe, and crocodile trophy hunting in Zimbabwe. We've also tested the framework against various case studies that we've collected in the species use database, the second tool that you're also going to hear about today. We're currently in the process of writing up the framework and publishing the results with some additional support from UNEP. So look out for a couple of journal articles, which will be coming out in the coming months. And we're also currently exploring the opportunities for fundraising to roll out the framework and test it further in as wide a range of species use initiatives as possible, so that we can further refine it and make it as widely applicable as possible. Our ultimate ambition is that this could turn into some kind of standard for assessing the sustainability of different wild species uses. We're some way from that at the moment, but that's our ambition. If you're interested to try out the tool, if you've got an initiative that's using wild species, this is the website where you can find out more details about it, and where you can download the framework and the Excel testing tool. So please do visit that. And there's also a feedback form on that site. We'd love to hear from anybody that does want to test the tool in terms of how easy it is to apply and how applicable the different principles are to different wildlife uses. I'll stop there, but you'll hear 2 case studies now where we've tried the tool, and I'm going to pass first of all to Nastia Timoshina from Traffic, where they tested it against the game meat industry in Tanzania, so the whole of the industry. And then we'll hear from Tina Hiller from Endangered Wildlife Trust, who tested it against 3 game ranching facilities in South Africa. So Nastia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dilys, and hello everyone. So I'm going to talk about this specific example of applying the framework to a particular situation. And the first thing I wanted to do is just say big thanks to my colleagues listed on this slide who've done most of heavy lifting actually implementing this, and I'm taking credit for presenting today. But so I wanted to give you a little bit of context for this case study. So in 2020, the government of Tanzania established new regulations allowing the selling of wild meat, also legally referred to as game meat, through licensed outlets that are known as game meat selling facilities provided in the regulations. These regulations are important because they frame, of course, the governance of legal hunting, trading, and sale of game meat, allowing Tanzanian business that meets all the specific requirements to open a game meat selling facility and sell game meat to the public. The current, so just again a bit of a allocation and the context. While the regulations and the sector is countrywide, we looked in particular at, in the case of northern Tanzania, at this sort of subnational level, where interfaces involve wildlife, livestock, peridomestic species, and humans as well. And also, it is the region in Tanzania with the highest number of registered game meat selling facilities. So it was pertinent to consider this. This current framework for regulating the game meat selling activities is complex, and as I mentioned, it was only adopted in 2020, so the industry has developed extremely rapidly the back of this. As part of the project interventions in the last 3 years, we've undertaken several assessments evaluating the performance of game mid-selling scheme and gathering evidence from through a sustainability, legality, and safety lens. So one of the basic things that we've done, and in fact I'm showing it again as something that we found extremely useful to have a full idea of as you start thinking about assessing the full sustainability of operations or sector, is to create a really basic but detailed supply chain or value chain for the game meat, which as you can see on this slide, and I appreciate it's difficult to read all the small font. What it's trying to pull together is the kind of supply chain view from the sourcing to consumption of these products, but also a totality or representation of various stakeholder groups that play an important role for either regulating or operating in this sector. So again, with this case study, what we've done is more looking at the whole sector. So rather than looking at a particular supply chain, could we use this framework to help us assess and consider, in particular, some of the specific risk parameters that have been identified for the sector? And the three particular points here, and they are echoing back to the Global Biodiversity Framework, targets 5 and 9 in particular, talking about the legality, sustainability, and safety of wild use. So all these issues being a kind of combined. Also to maybe mention where what we're looking at the sectoral level, so this is not one species or one value chain or one supply chain application. In our review of this sectoral work, there is about 35 species that are included in the practices of hunting and wild meat sourcing. They come from different regulations covered by the Tanzanian laws. And this picture simply shows the changes or the changing practices and sourcing areas from which the products come into the value chains. So now onto the application of the framework. What we've done is a two-step process, which again, hopefully could be quite interesting to consider in terms of the future implementation or using it in different contexts. So first we did the internal evaluation of the framework, and I wanted to call out specifically here what levels of expertise were involved in doing this, because I think part of the testing of the framework was to consider who you need to have in the room or what level of knowledge you need to have in the room in order to actually use the framework effectively. So in terms of internal evaluation of framework, we had staff with fairly varied experiences from environmental law and law enforcement to forest management and trade and social and behavioral change expertise. And in terms of methods, we had a little bit of a deep dive into what the project was like, what the sector looks like, and then the team went through and provided some scores that Dilys was talking about, and also had a discussion and reflections on how it was used. Then, very importantly, this initial exercise and sort of discussion has been informing the external evaluation of the framework. So we organized an external workshop that brought together representatives of the Game Meat Selling Advisory Committee, as well as Tanzania Wildlife Management Authority and representatives of Tanzania Wild Farmers and Game Meat Selling Association, as well as local hunters and game meat selling facility operators. So a fairly large kind of broad range of stakeholders, but hopefully you'll remember the slide a couple of slides back, which just shows the whole range of stakeholders involved in this value chain. Of course, the workshop wasn't able to bring everyone together. What we did is, again, a stepwise process. So first, having in-depth discussions about the game meat selling industry and the sector, and then having an initial first reflections, and then following with breakout in-depth discussions in 3 groups, focusing on health, economic and ecological dimensions. And then each group was also asked to discuss social and welfare dimensions. And there was a particular reason for it, because we realized that it's been quite challenging because there weren't experts with specific specific aspects focusing on welfare or social issues in the room. So it was in fact very interesting dynamic to explore how much the stakeholders in the room could take this evaluation and consider the different principles. So in terms of the results, one wanted to include this table again to give you a sense, and maybe I think the question of how much knowledge there is as we're doing this assessments in a comprehensive way, especially on maybe what is less frequently considered in the conservation field as sustainability lenses, is important. So when the participants were asked to express their consideration of the relevance of these different aspects to the Tanzania game meat selling industry, and you'll see that like social as well as welfare have been the lowest in terms of perceived relevance. And again, how much that was because of the expertise in the room, or also a perception of what is specifically relevant is a different issue. Each group has gone through the whole scoring sheet and did the scores, and then the group altogether again agreed on the scores and filled in one sheet that created this chart again that Dilys introduced, which is quite interesting to interpret as well, because one, it seems to be scoring extremely high on the ecological level, which is extremely positive. So I think there is a general perception and an understanding that in terms of the implementation of good practices coming to sustainable use from the ecological perspective and the population management, it is positive. We have a lot less positive assessment, for example, on human health principles, and this is a concern, and this has been again not unexpected, but this sort of risk of zoonotic disease spillover and requires immediate mitigation. And then you'll see also economic dimension has a very low score. So just from this pie chart, from the chart, and this has, there has been a bit of reflection considering that the industry is very nascent, it's just being created. So in fact, probably a lot of systems and kind of good practices haven't been quite in place yet, or haven't been operational yet. And then finally, we had an actual participant feedback asking how easy was it to navigate through the scoring tool, and was this framework a useful tool in evaluating sustainability? Was generally very positive results in terms of considering how useful it could be. There has been some specific points about the principles as well. So for instance, consideration of whether reverse zoonosis is not included in the framework at the moment, and really is focusing very strongly on human health rather than the risk of transmitting pathogens back to wild animals. And then, so finally, conclusions, recommendations, and insights. So general consideration is that the framework can be a valuable tool for assessing whether the use is well managed in the context of commerce, food security, conservation, and public health. There has been a consideration, which I think Tina will be able to illustrate with an example that she is giving of how much this assessment could be more effective, or give more precise recommendations when the scope is narrowed to specific individual supply chains rather than take a sectoral approach. As our kind of example of this engagement demonstrated, you need stakeholders with very different backgrounds and expertise to bring into the room to be able to discuss. I think especially if you're taking a more sectoral or industry level approach. And then we had a really we've been fortunate, and it's been designed as such to have a strong mix of both kind of law enforcement officers, field operating practitioners, as well as high-level decision makers, which allowed us to have an analysis at different practice and also policy and legal levels, which has been extremely helpful, but could be, of course, difficult to get all that group of stakeholders in the room. And so finally, and this has been maybe one of the most important findings of this exercise, the opportunities that the discussions created and this agreed vision on scoring, on recommendations, I think proved extremely useful in order to develop this roadmap or follow-up interventions to improve sustainability in the sector. And I think it also showed some of the risk areas that maybe have been considered quite in the same way or given the similar important prominence by all the stakeholders. So with this, thanks for listening. There is a report we've published a couple of months ago that dives a lot more in the game meat industry in Tanzania. Hopefully you'll find it interesting to read. And big thanks to all the funders who supported this work. And over to Tina.
Super. Thank you so much, Nastia. I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you see it now? No, not yet. Huh? Right, it's coming. All right. A warm welcome from my side to everyone. I'm presenting the second case of the test cases that we performed for this sustainability framework. My colleague we did that through the auspices of the Endangered Wildlife Trust, the EWT in South Africa. My colleague Andrew Taylor is somewhere in the audience, so big shout out to you, Andrew. We tested the framework against wild meat again, so game meat, as it's also known in South Africa, but we had a slightly different approach, which I think is interesting from what was done in Tanzania, because we went and we actually tried to understand how sustainable the individual facilities were. So we applied it to individual game ranches or wildlife reserves that also provide game meat. A little bit of a background there as well from my side about the sector. So South Africa's what it's called wildlife economy. It's quite vibrant and very diverse. I put an overview here on the right-hand side where you can see that there is a lot of different types of facilities. And so these different ranches or reserves or farms, they have a diverse offering of services and products, and many are mixed between livestock, agriculture, and wildlife. So very diverse, very vibrant, rather young still as a sector, but still you could call it established. The biggest thing is the Game Theft Act of 1991, which allowed, game farms or game ranches to own the wildlife that is on their property as long as it is fenced. So this is sort of the basis for this model to work. And I also wanted to mention that we also chose this as our test case because especially last year, 2023, the South African government issued the game meat strategy for South Africa. So very similar again to what we heard about Tanzania, but even younger. Yeah, so it's something that has only been out since last year and is sort of tested, if you want, or piloted at the moment. The sector is an interesting one to test it against the game meat because on the one hand side, there's a lot of talk and opportunities about biodiversity conservation on vast extensions of land, because the private land is about 15% of South Africa's land surface. So it's an interesting proposition there, and there's also always a push for socioeconomic development in rural areas through the wildlife economy. So that's the opportunities. At the same time, there's often criticisms that are voiced. Animal welfare is a prominent one. The zoonotic diseases we've heard as well is always a worry. Intensification, so breeding of wildlife is a worry that is brought up when we look at the ecological principles, and a lack of transformation. So, you can see a lot of different worries about the sector, if it's sustainable or not, and that's what we then decided to base our test case on. How we did it is as I said, slightly different. We really went to different facilities and assessed them individually. And for that, we had to do a bit of preparation to say, okay, how, if we as external assessors would then score at the end, which is the data that we're going to use in order to confidently score each facility. So what we did is we developed a questionnaire. I put it on the left-hand side at the bottom there. It's become rather long. I think it's about 85 questions that we had to ask in order to get enough data to really score all the principles. And we also asked the facilities for their game management plan and their business plans so that we can sort of verify some of our scorings. And then we went into the tools and we scored all of the facilities. I show you the ones that that we did here now, a bit of an overview so that you can see how different they were and also what the scoring tool then did. The first facility in the Limpopo province we would call that a wildlife reserve. It's very much focused on tourism, about 1,000 hectares, and more of a conservation lifestyle approach to the property. But they also do breeding of rare species, meat production, hunting, and these things, although they stay away from trophy hunting. They have an on-site abattoir, so a slaughterhouse, but it's not in use. So they're not registered under the Game Meat Act that I mentioned before. But they do have a very rigorous ecological management plan that they have implemented. So that's the first facility. By comparison, the second facility in the Eastern Cape is a 2,300 hectare game ranch that has 1,700 hectares extensive, but then also 600 hectares of breeding semi-intensive wildlife use. And they do have an abattoir. So they have one of these, probably one of the first registered game meat slaughterhouses, abattoirs on their property, and also a rigorous management plan. So slightly different from the first facility. And the third facility also in the Eastern Cape, a very big one, 50,000 hectares, but a mixed farm. So they have Angora goats, do mohair production, but then also have wildlife. And they're very much specialized on trophy hunting and what is called in South Africa biltong hunting. So that would be the hunters that come and hunt for their meat. So the meat is all it's only consumed so to speak by the hunters, and for private and personal use and not sold, whereas the first two facilities also did sell some of the game meat. So that's the third one in this mixed setup with trophy hunting and meat hunting. And once we sat down, or was my colleague Andrew, visited all of them, sat down with them, looked at the facilities, and then we did the scoring afterwards. And I'm just showing the 3 different results right next to each other, which were quite promising because they're sort of what we expected. The wildlife reserve scored very highly on the ecological front, also economically fairly good. Human health, because they're not registered under the, they don't have this registered abattoir under the game meat strategy, was a bit of a concern, and also because it is the social component needs improvement or could be improved there. It's a private property, there are no land claims on it, so I would say the relationships and the interactions with the local communities is fairly low. By comparison, the commercial game meat facility, the second one, you can see a big emphasis on the human health, because obviously now they are registered under this game meat strategy, so that became a big point to yeah, to show that they are legal. The animal welfare needs to be high under that legislation. So in general, you could see they scored the highest on all the principles. A lot due to meeting the legislation, the new one, but they also said how tedious it was, and it took them more than a year to become registered. So they weren't really very happy about it, but from a sustainability point of view, it looked very different, or the best of the pictures. Whereas the third facility, the mixed farm, again, you can see the human health, the ecological and the social principles due to being the mixed farm. Doing the hunting, doing the trophy hunting, you can see a tendency going inwards on the scores of the principles. So overall, our verdict was that it was a very useful tool. Also, then what we haven't managed yet to go back to the facilities, discuss the results with them, think about where they want and could improve further in terms of their sustainability. But we can see that you can have some meaningful discussions based on the scoring and these results. And the other thing is that we went then back and we looked at the principles and how easy it was for us to do the scoring. You can see largely green, yeah. So anything that is sort of the slighter green, we said, okay, one could still tweak maybe the wording here and there a little bit. The yes ones are fully applicable for the cases that we had. The yellow ones, we could maybe not review a little bit the rating scale, where we said maybe it could be changed a little bit more. And the ends were the ones that Dilys mentioned, we'd taken them out, because they were not applicable for the cases that we had. You can see there's not many principles that were completely not applicable for our 3 facilities. All right, so that's from my side. The second case, and I'm handing over to Nick because he's going to talk about the species use database, and hopefully, many more of you will add to that, to examples to that research.
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, thanks for that example. That was really great. Yeah, as Tina just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the species use database. I will just share my screen so I get my presentation up. Okay, hopefully you can all see that now. So yeah, my name is Nick Long. I'm the program officer for SULI, and I want to start by thanking you all for your attendance. Great to see a lot of you on the webinar today. So following on quite nicely from the 5D framework we've just been discussing, I'll be discussing another SULI initiative and the second tool of the webinar, which is the species use database, one of our kind of flagship projects as a specialist group. And I'll be talking about the motivation behind its creation and its kind of continued development. And then I'll very quickly share my screen and do a sort of a quick whistle-stop tour of the website and how you can download it, how you can download data, and then how you can enter a record as well. So I'll try and whip through that. So as we've kind of been hearing already, the use of wild species is obviously critical on a number of dimensions: culturally, economically, ecologically. And this is really true on a global scale. It's especially important for indigenous and local communities who are often sort of culturally intertwined with the species that they harvest for food and fuel and materials. And in fact, 70% of us are reliant in some way on wild species. As we can see here, quite a prescient quote from the IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment that 1 in 5 people globally rely on wild harvested food and fuel wood for cooking. That's almost 2.4 billion people who use wild species to meet their daily needs. So clearly very important. Clearly a significant factor in biodiversity conservation, and we need a way of recording and quantifying this use, and that's where tools like the species use database come in, and as we've just heard, the 5D sustainability assessment framework. So how do we achieve use that is sustainable? How do we measure sustainability, and how do we record and quantify it? I think we probably all agree that the use of wild species is inevitable, and it's vital to livelihoods globally. So how do we make sure this use is sustainable use rather than over-exploitation, which is potentially damaging to wild populations and eventually damaging to people in the long term if we lose biodiversity that way? And as I said, we need tools to help us do this, to meet the kind of twin challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change, tools that can both record and quantify species use. And that's where these two initiatives come in. The species use database is really aiming to build an evidence base on the importance socially, ecologically, and economically of species use and livelihoods that rely directly on it in a centralized, free-to-access online resource, which is what the species use database is. So yeah, what is the species use database? It's an online resource that's been created by SULI to record and document species use globally. So it's online now, speciesusedatabase.com. And it's, yeah, the aim of it really is to provide an evidence base for the importance of use, and just to have a place where you can access, a user can access records of species use, and you can see the evidence of how important it is. And it was really motivated by two things. So initially by the lack of information on the IUCN Red List, which is obviously an incredible resource, but often there was a lack of information in the use and trade section, which is there. It's present on all Red List species pages. But often there wasn't that much detail, and there weren't any examples of use of certain species, so that was often a bit lacking. And secondly, as I said before, it was a desire to have a high quality, reliable evidence base from which to draw from, and to sort of be the global go-to authority on species use. And yeah, we were collecting records on use that are judged to be both sustainable and unsustainable, with each entry, each record in the database for a specific species, at a specific time in a specific place. So there's specific records for each species. Now SPUD, and this is the nice acronym we have for it, SPUD, which is quite memorable, has not been designed to make kind of formal assessments of sustainability. That's where you would have a framework like 5D. And if there is information about sustainability in the record, that's fine, that'll be entered in. And a user will only enter what's present in the record that they're entering into the database. So if there is a formal sustainability assessment, they'll enter that in. But if there isn't one, the user isn't making a judgment of sustainability there. Now, records are predominantly coming from scientific literature at this point. Scientific literature, technical reports, grey literature, things like that. But we do want to expand the range of sources to include indigenous and cultural knowledge, and other sources. But predominantly so far, it's come from scientific literature. And this is the front page of the database. This is just a screenshot, but I will take you there on my screen momentarily. And as you can see, as I say, it's currently live. You can see we have more than 400 records of species use added in and accessible on there. 324 species from 105 countries or regions. And this is just a little bit more detail on the navigation system on the database. You can see we have an about page, which just shows you what some information on the development and motivation behind the database. Then you can click Explore Records, which will take you to the database itself. And then you can register to contribute if you would like to contribute a record of species use. And then down there you can see syntheses, which is where hopefully in future we will be able to reach a critical mass of records for certain species. And we'll be able to produce syntheses, detailed syntheses on the sustainability of that specific use. So then we'd then be able to make a judgment on sustainability, a formal judgment of sustainability, once we've reached enough records on that species to come to that conclusion. And now this is the database itself. You can see the top few records there and the search function on the left, where you can use the various filters to identify the records you want. You can filter by geographic location, practice of use, purpose of end use, ecological sustainability. You can see there's a number of options there to filter down to the records you're interested in. Or you can just search, it's quite simple, you can just search the species scientific name or the common name. If you want all the records for lion, for example, you can just type in lion and it would take you there. So it really is quite simple to use. And if you want to download a record, you can download an individual record by just hitting the download record summary button at the top of any record you click into. And that'll download a PDF version of the record, so quite a simple way of doing it. Or the other option, which we've just added recently, is you can bulk download a selection of records. So if you wanted to download all the records on lions, for example, you could type in lion, and then you would select the checkbox at the top. And then that will download them into an Excel sheet, which is in a format that you can do analysis on in R or Python. And yeah, a user can bulk download all the records on lions and then conduct analysis on them. And then to submit a record to the database, we have an online entry form, which you'd need to contribute. You need to register as a contributor first, which will come to us, and then we'll approve your account. And then you can begin to submit a record by going to the Contribute tab of the database. Will take you to the record entry form, as you can see here. And these are all the sections a contributor would need to fill out, covering a variety of topics. And this is arranged in a similar style to the 5D Sustainability Assessment Framework. It has all the same dimensions of sustainability, so ecological, social, economic, human health, and animal health and welfare. So it's been done to mirror that quite effectively. So they work quite nicely in tandem together. And it's important to note at this point that even though it looks like quite a long and daunting record entry form, it is really quite simple to fill out. And you don't even need to fill out all of these. You just need to fill out part 1, which is the required information, and part 2, which is the record source and data entry details. And then parts 3, 4, and 5 are, if you have extra information, more detailed information on the use, the users, how much money is made from it, how much a carcass in a game meat operation is being sold for example. You can enter that information here in these more detailed sections, but you don't need to. If you want to just enter the parts 1 and 2, which takes about 10-15 minutes, you can do that, and that's enough to submit a record and see it appear in the database. So if the contributor has the information, that's great, but if they don't, a basic record will do, and you can still submit that. So yeah, the future of the database. We're trying to appeal to a wide audience, and we see this as being a really incredibly useful tool for providing up-to-date, reliable, and in-depth evidence on the sustainability of species use. So we're aiming for policymakers, decision makers, to academics and educators, conservation practitioners, private sector, civil society, and NGOs, as well as anybody who's just interested in learning more about species use. And we're also looking to integrate with existing databases. Now, we're currently in the process of doing a really interesting integration with the Red List, hopefully in the near future, so that information from the species use database will appear in the Red List assessments. So if you go to the Red List page for rhino, for example, you might see some records. You might see at least a link to the species use database, which will take you to any records we have on white rhino. So it's going to be hopefully a really interesting integration with them. And as I already mentioned, we're hoping to produce kind of high quality syntheses for certain species using records from the database. And it'll give us a clearer picture of the sustainability or not of that specific use. And then I'm just going to stop my share for a minute. And then I'm just going to share my screen. Once more. Yep, so this is the species use database itself. I've just got it live up here on as it would appear as a website. And then you can see the about page here, and this just gives you some background that I've just been through. So if you want to go and peruse that, that's all there for you. And it just gives you a bit more information about how we've structured the database and some of the categories of use we have there. So extractive and non-extractive practices, etc. And then you can go back to the main page. If you want to explore the database yourself, you can go into this. And then, as I said before, these are all of the records you have here. You can see the target species, scientific name, common name, the location, purpose of end use, practice of use, and whether or not the use is sustainable, or if there has been a judgment made in that record as to whether it's sustainable or not. You can also click entered as well, and this will give you these are the most recently entered records. So these ones that have just been done, these have been done 3 days ago. And then if you want to use the search function up here, you can filter by region, or you could filter by ecological sustainability. So we'll just click that, and we'll go, if we go, yes, considered sustainable, there's 139 records in there that are all sustainable. And if you wanted to download all those records, you could click on this, export selected records. This probably isn't going to work now because it's live, but okay, we won't wait for that. That's okay. But that would happen, then you would be able to download them into an Excel sheet, as I just showed. And then if you also wanted to go and register to contribute, I'll log into my account. So we'll do that quickly. So we're logged in. And then if we go back, we can go contribute a record. And this takes you, as I mentioned, to the data entry form. I won't go through the whole process of entering a record, but it really is very straightforward. You'd enter the scientific name, local or common names, any secondary species, the geographic location, the scale of assessment, the time period, and then how the species is sourced. And then, as we already mentioned, we have all of the same dimensions as the 5D Sustainability Assessment Framework. So we have economic sustainability, social sustainability, human health, animal health, and welfare. So those are all on there as well. And then you can also enter information about the source of the record, whether it's peer reviewed, and then your own details as to who you are entering the record, and then you can hit submit, and eventually it'll give you a preview, and then you can submit that to the database. So that's a quick kind of whistle-stop tour of the database there. And I think we can probably pass over to some questions. I'm sure there will be some.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, we've had a couple of questions, some of which we've been answering live. If other people have got questions that they want to put into the Q&A, please do so. There was one here from Vicky Jones, which is basically, I think, in response perhaps to your presentation, Tina, but saying that if we're using questionnaires or doing things like self-reporting, so for example, with the ranches as the basis of the assessment, we're basically taking it on trust that what's described to us is what is actually happening. And if there were illegalities going on, you know, we wouldn't necessarily be able to detect them. I think that is a fair comment. And I think one of the things we're doing with the testing process is looking at sort of different ways of doing the assessment, whether it should be self-assessment. We were initially inspired by the Protected Areas Management Effectiveness Tracking tool, which is a self-assessment based tool. But as I said in my opening presentation, ultimately we'd like to move to seeing whether this could evolve into some kind of certification scheme, which would then be independently assessed. But at the moment we're trying all different forms of assessment, self-assessment, expert assessment, etc. Tina, I don't know whether you want to comment on any specific cases.
I'm very happy to comment, because I think you're hitting and we discussed it, as you remember, in our core team. It's like, what are the application cases? And what we found in this case, it is sort of these facilities wanted to know themselves how they would fare. So it's sort of a voluntary thing to do because they want to improve. So in a way, yes, it's a fair comment, but I would say, you know, if that is the intention to use the tool for these purposes, it's a very good intention. It was still, you know, with a bit of an external assessment, because obviously they didn't know all the questions that we would ask. Some of them were doubled, etc., to make sure that we would, you know, see something that comes out maybe that didn't line up. And ideally in such an assessment scenario, you would then also try and speak to others and make it broader. For us, it was really this piloting. Does the framework work? Does it deliver meaningful results? And is it easy to apply? It wasn't really meant to be now the ultimate assessment of these facilities. But I think there is still, even though, you know, we have the certification in mind, I think there's really a fair case to be made for any facility, even to do a quick check, you know, how can we improve? And I think that would be a good way of using this instrument as well.
Thanks, Tina. We also had a question from Louise Swemmer about the scale of application. And again, this is something that we're testing. So as you'll have seen from the two case studies presented, one is at a whole industry scale, a sector scale in Tanzania, and then in South Africa we've looked at specific facilities. I think when we were first thinking about developing the framework, we had a facility or a specific enterprise in mind. But again, that's our interest in the testing process, is looking at, well, can we actually apply this at different scales? Hence, Traffic's interest in testing this at a sector scale. And this is why we want to roll out the testing further and apply it to a much wider range of cases at different scales, from individual uses of individual species, you know, up to small and big facilities, informal and formal. A lot of wildlife use practices are, you know, individual harvesters collecting from the wild. So, you know, we have to think about how you can apply the framework to those kinds of situations, you know, right up to these whole sectors. So we don't yet know at what scale the framework will best be applied. And I think we'll only be able to make conclusions on that once we've tested it a lot more. There was another question in the Q&A about, it was actually more of a comment rather than a question from Peter Mills about culture being another pillar of sustainability. And I replied to that a bit online saying we tried to address cultural issues within our social pillar. Just looking back at the framework and looking at the principles we've got there, we haven't got too much detail actually on cultural issues. So that would be maybe something that we could also think to bring into a revised version of the framework. So any kind of like international standards you've got on cultural issues, we'd be very pleased to receive those. I think that was all of the questions. Peter, you'd put quite a lot of comments also in the Q&A around breeding of colour variants not being, you know, that can't be considered as a sustainable conservation activity. It may well be sustainable from health, welfare, economic and social pillars though. So again, it all comes down to how you define sustainability. Yes, you made the point also about subjective data and not statistically testable. Yeah, I mean, I think we completely agree with you. And I think what we're saying here with this framework, and as Tina alluded to, that anything is better than nothing, and using it just as a sort of a self-check process to see how you're doing and where you can make improvements is better than not even having any reflection. So it's definitely something that's evolving and we're developing, but you know, it's not the perfect tool at the moment. Just sort of looking at other, so Vicky Jones, another question here, in maybe Nastya, one for you. In assessing whole sectors, are you still able to assess only those who come forward voluntarily? I guess that won't give a full overview of sustainability, but will tell you something about those most willing to come forward. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could go to a sector ourselves as independent researchers and try and apply our framework to it, but you need people that understand the sector to be able to answer some of the questions, as Nastya was alluding to. Nastya, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I think it would be really interesting to see how else the framework can be applied, because, you know, so in this case, we've had a confined kind of we had a situation and then a confined project as interventions in through parallel work. So it was kind of convenient and almost coincidental that we were able to convene these stakeholder discussions that were pretty you know, wide-reaching. I actually think that at the sectoral level, the application of this framework could be extremely useful, like process tool, to be able to get joined up and connected vision on the future and the need for addressing unsustainability, right? So where there are gaps and need for more action. This, you know, in our experience in Tanzania, I think the process of coming up with a grid score and debating, you know, is this correct or not, actually led to quite a lot of agreement on some of the really pertinent actions that have to take place. And I think this is a great outcome of the application of the framework at that high level, because you could almost imagine what the framework allows, and you'll see it if you look at the tool. It allows you to come up with almost like improvement steps. So following the assessment, it asks what could happen next so that you can actually improve the scores. So yeah, I think it's an extremely powerful tool that could be used as a really useful framework to bring together stakeholders' opinions about a very difficult subject. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Nastya. We're nearly out of time, but I just to respond to a couple of comments in the Q&A about where the framework might or might not be relevant. For example, North American meat harvesting is potentially relevant everywhere. So please just download the tool and try and apply it to your particular examples, and then let us know whether it is relevant or not to your particular cases. There was one question that I'll give to Nick, which is about the database and about how we validate the contributions to ensure quality.
Yeah, I've just seen that. So thus far, we haven't had, as you can probably see on the database, we don't have a vast quantity of data to be analysing and making sure it's valid. So I've just been checking new records as they go in to make sure that they seem valid to me and that the sources seem okay. In the future, it'll probably be a capacity issue in checking the number of records that go in, because then if you need a validity checker every time a record goes in, that needs somebody to go and check that the record is valid. And it could be a capacity and funding issue to have someone doing that. So it's a challenge that we'll be looking at. But at the moment, I've just been checking the records that are going in there to make sure they're valid. And a lot of them have been done by consultants and people working with Suli. So those are all valid. But yeah, it's something that we're thinking about in the future, and hopefully trying to create an environment where contributors, a bit like Wikipedia, can go in and check the validity of things and change them if necessary. So that's the sort of thing we're aiming for. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, Nick. And yes, one more about local languages. Is using the framework in local languages acceptable? Yes, indeed. And great if anybody has the capacity to translate it. And then please share back any translated versions of the framework. We'd love to see them. And yeah, we've been very Anglo-centric, unfortunately, in our development. It is something that, you know, as we gain traction with this, we'll seek to get it translated into more languages so that it's more widely applicable. So yeah, apologies for the limitations there. I think we are probably out of time, but thanks very much for your interest in this, for the questions and the chat. We're really open to, you know, taking any further questions. Please feel free to email us or be in touch. And as I say, please do download the tools from the website and use them. We'd really like to get feedback, good or bad. We're not sort of trying to say we've done this now and it's the best thing since sliced bread. We're really interested in improving it, trying to make it as useful as possible to as wide a range of wildlife uses as possible, and also to taking criticisms on the limitations of it. You know, it's a complicated thing to do. And, you know, we've been told this, it's not possible to assess sustainability of all these different uses. And we know the science is complex, but our approach to this is it's better to try and do something than to just say it's too difficult, so we won't do anything. So that's our starting point. And that's, you know, the basis of the framework. So please do test it and please do send your feedback. We'd love to hear from you and engage further with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining.